remember just a few months ago, the big story was about the massive COP26 conference in Glasgow. A group of nations there would actually promise to help finance our move away from using coal to generate power to more renewable energy. Countries like the US, France, the UK, they actually sent people here before the conference so they could tell us that they would provide billions of dollars worth of investment. But is that situation now changing with the invasion of Ukraine, turmoil on international markets, and in the European Union, the acceptance of gas as a renewable resource because it doesn't pollute to the same extent that coal does? Heidi Barends is the head of sustainable finance at Absa Corporate and Investment. Heidi, good afternoon to you, and thanks for the time. There were big promises at COP26. A lot of money would be coming here. We would have solar power plants literally all over the country. Has any of that money actually arrived here yet?
Hi, Stephen. The very sad news is no, none of that money has arrived yet. And there's many questions around that money, actually, that we should be worried about, I think, as a general public in South Africa.
What's gone wrong? I mean, was the promise not really a promise?
I do think the promise, I think there's negotiations that are ongoing at the moment. But I think what's going wrong is that there's just not enough transparency around what's happening with the funding. I think the presidency started a task team now to enable a good negotiation team that can enable that funding. But we haven't really heard anything since the big splash at COP26. So was it just a promise? I'm a bit worried, to be honest.
Could all of what was promised also be delayed by what's happening in Ukraine? The people who would be dealing with that for those countries, who would be dealing with, a just transition, who would be dealing with energy issues, may be a little distracted for various reasons.
I think it's a fair question, and I think resources in general, the question is what's going to happen with the allocation of resources and funding? Is it going to be used to is it going into ammunition and to enable a war, or will it be to transition and help decrease inequality in Africa? I think that is something that is a good question, and I'm not sure that we know the answer because the funding, it was still a promise and is still a promise. And is that promise now even more at threat given what's happening in the Ukraine and kind of security concerns across the European continent?
Heidi, you work in banking. I don't need to tell you that there's financing and there's financing. Financing can be, well, we'll just give you the money. Financing can be, we'll give you the money and call it a loan, but we're giving it to you on such good terms that we're really giving you the money. There's also financing that it looks like we're giving you the money, but actually we're going to make a lot more money out of you when you try and pay it back. I think they usually call it a home loan. What do you think is going to happen here? Could we find that the nature of the promise is now going to be something we fight over?
I think that's a really, really big, good question, Stephen, and that's exactly what I'm worried about. I mean, that huge amount of money, what is it? Is it grants, like you said? Is it just money that we get and there's no repayment? Or is it a loan funding? That's a really critical question. And at the moment, we don't actually have any information about it. And as a South African public and kind of being in the financial services industry myself, we can't really evaluate if this deal is going to be good for the country or actually cripple it further, because we're in a position where we really can't actually afford more debt if we are kind of critical about our balance sheet as the sovereign. And kind of this, is it a gift or is it really kind of more shackles that we can't really move further? I think that's a good question and a big concern I have that I hope the rest of the South African public has too.
I mean, you make the point that it's not transparent. This is billions of dollars moving from several governments to another government. I mean, there's a massive case for transparency here.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, we're speaking about ESG, and ESG is really having its moment at the moment where everybody's talking about it. But I think the big thing that's missing in this conversation is the G. Where's the governance? And that's really around where's the transparency, who's accountable, where will the funding go, what will we find out as the public? Or will it all be behind closed doors and legal agreements that nobody can ever see, where nobody can evaluate if it actually was ultimately good for the country or actually quite negatively impactful? I think that's the kind of concern. And when we talk about ESG and COP26 and climate change and all these things, it's all really critical. But if we don't do it with the G and it's not done with robust governance and processes in place, it does kind of leave the public and kind of question what's going on. Can we trust what's going on?
You talk about ESG. I had to Google it, Heidi. Environmental, social, and corporate governance. Is that what you mean?
That's what I mean. Thanks, Stephen.
No, it's nice to know that Wikipedia is right on some things. We've always known that fighting climate change is something that's going to require a global effort. It needs everybody to be involved in this. We now run a risk of a massive division in the world, essentially along the lines of, well, perhaps sort of those who support Russia's invasion or those who don't, depending on, there are lots of different ways this could go. Either way, it looks like the world is about to get more divided than it was just a few months ago at COP26. Is that going to make it harder to deal with climate change? There won't be a global effort. There may not even be a forum at which we can discuss climate change.
That's a really great question, Stephen. I mean, to be honest, it's been quite interesting because as much as we have this global forum in the form of COP, Conference of the Parties where everybody meets, it's actually interesting to see how it's developing. And actually a lot of climate policy is being developed on a regional basis and then kind of being enforced, essentially using the power structures that already exist in the world. And what I mean by this more specifically, the EU is really considering a carbon border adjustment mechanism. And basically what this means is if a country doesn't have a carbon tax, then any goods that are made in that country that is possibly using a lot of fossil fuel, then they'll be taxed before they come into the EU, which essentially says to the rest of the world, if you don't tax carbon and if you don't follow our rules, you don't get to play with us anymore. And that kind of is not really necessarily on the narrative of we're all solving this together, because a lot of the EU is, and kind of the global north, the EU, the United States, etc., they've been huge emitters of carbon for a long time, and now they're enforcing their rules on the developing world that hasn't had the same opportunities to develop. So I do kind of wonder to what degree, losing COP is really, hopefully Ukraine and the conflict won't result in those negotiations completely not being able anymore. But I do wonder to what degree they've been successful in really driving a holistic agenda, and to what degree it's actually been the powers that are already in place driving their agenda to a large degree into the developing world.
There's been a change around the issue of gas, and for a long time gas was seen as a fossil fuel. I think it is a fossil fuel, but banks refused to fossil finance fuel projects. Now it seems that because of an EU decision, gas may be considered something that can be financed again. Is that quite a big change?
It's a huge, it really depends on what hat I put on. So from an NGO perspective and a climate change activism perspective, essentially, if we really take climate change seriously, then we need to really transition out of all fossil fuels as quickly as possible. From a different perspective around what's practical, what can be done, there is the question, and gas if you look at the numbers on Google and you look at how much it emits per kind of energy that you're trying to produce or electricity produced for coal and gas, it really is half the amount of CO2. So it's from an emissions perspective, it really is a huge difference if you're burning gas or if you're burning oil. So that does make a huge difference. But I think kind of if I put it into the different hats, the NGO or the activists' views is that any bit of carbon that we continue emitting is bad for the world, and we need to be a lot more drastic, and we're not urgent enough, and it's not radical enough, and we need to stop as urgently as possible. And the other perspective, which is the second narrative, which has come through kind of essentially now hugely being driven as well and supported by the EU, is to say, whoa, that's not practical. Let's take smaller steps, and we need gas because we can't jump the step, essentially. So I think that there's nearly like I would nearly call it a generational conflict, because you've got young people that are really worried about what will the world look like at 2050? Will I be able to have children? Or won't the world kind of be able to support that? Versus a generation that's saying, it's working pretty well the way it is, and we are going to manage a transition, but we're going to do it in small steps. So I think the urgency is very different depending on what perspective you look at, and that narrative really changed. The International Energy Agency wrote a report at the end of last year that basically said we don't need to take anything else out of the soil. No new fossil fuel at all, which was quite a strong voice, because for a long time there was like gas transition, and the IEA had this view, which was quite different. And now the EU's come out and said gas is fine. So I think this conflict between is gas okay and isn't has actually been brooding for a long time. And with the EU's decision, it's kind of been the final hammer to say this is where the world is now. But I do think it'll be challenged from activists and NGOs across the world.
Heidi Barends, Head of Sustainable Finance at Absa Corporate and Investment Banking. Thanks very much indeed. I do appreciate the time here on Newsfeed.